very broadly about the Canadian context. And I'm going to do that by drawing, in particular, on the book I wrote that's based on qualitative and quantitative analysis of women's entrepreneurship in Canada. And I come to this subject very much, I'm a sociologist, that's my training, so I'm interested in the phenomenon of women's entrepreneurship, both in terms of what it means economically, but also what it means socially and culturally and politically. So part of what I'm going to be talking about today sort of draws on some of the economic and business aspects of what's going on, but also around what the meaning of entrepreneurship is for women in terms of the quality of work life, the quest for meaningful work, so those types of things as well. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to talk briefly, try and put Canada in context, I hope a little bit to Japan, talk about the dramatic rise of entrepreneurship, and then about how changing institutions may have sort of fueled part of what we're seeing. And then in the second part, I'll focus in more specifically just on some key trends, some key issues that come out of my own work. It's not to say they're all of the issues covering the field, but they're things that were particularly intriguing for me. And then I'll just hopefully wrap up a little bit on future directions. Now I should warn you, Aegean and I were laughing beforehand because as usual I prepare far too many slides. So this may be a bit of a sort of a rapid gallop through. I sort of view it as a visitor to Victoria, like I'm taking snapshots outside different buildings or vistas of your beautiful city. And so this is kind of a bit of a travelogue, quick photos of different things. And inside of each one is probably a lot of things that we could talk about. And so hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to follow up with that on the questions. So just in terms of the dramatic rise, I start with some clippings. And when I started into this area over 10 years ago, I started clipping, of course, and I eventually gave up because, well, we don't clip anymore anyhow, because things are online. But there just is so much, there's so much written about this issue. It was such an intriguing thing. Why are women going into this area in such dramatic ways? And so this just gives you a bit of a flavor of it. Women have moved into entrepreneurship in Canada over the last 3 decades at a very rapid rate. They've far outpaced the entrance of men. And the other thing that's very interesting, and this links very much to your comments earlier, Philippe, is the whole phenomenon of the rise of entrepreneurship generally within Canadian society. So a whole shift in terms of our economic structure, move to more flexible firm sort of model where there are more opportunities because of outsourcing, because of major corporations sort of shedding different types of activities that they're no longer interested in doing. And also the rise or the shift to what some people have called skinny government, the sort of paring down, or anorexic government, sort of that paring down of the state. And so again, we see opportunities coming there as well. So women's entrepreneurship has grown, and this just gives you a sense. I'm mapping out, drawing a lot on Statistics Canada data. This is from the Labour Force Survey. Just giving you a picture. This is both for males and for women. The women are on the top, and the turquoise are female, what I call solos, so women who have small businesses where they're working on their own. And then the pink magenta is women who are employing others. And you can see we've gone from a period in the mid-70s where we had about 1 million people engaged in what I call SESBO, so self-employment or some kind of small business ownership. We've gone from about 1 million to now over about 2.5 million, and women have just very rapidly increased their share of that. And I'll come back to this later when we're talking about some of the trends. I wanted to put Canada just in context of other countries. So this is the G8. I know we now talk about the G20, but it was easier to get the G8 into the slide and make it readable. And you can see this is from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, the last cut that we had where we had Canadian data in that. And Canada ranks very highly. It's ranked as first for established businesses, and as you can see, second for what they call early stage activities. So these are prevalence rates. And I've put Japan as there as well, and I don't know how accurate that is in terms of what your sense of that is, but we can see in Canada we would have much higher prevalence rates relative to the Japanese context. And what I wanted to do is sort of talk about then why do we see that sort of change, and I'm really focusing on the mid-70s onwards. It's not to say that we do not have very interesting and high levels of entrepreneurship prior to that period. Certainly social historians have documented, if we look at sort of in terms of early industrializing Canada, a lot of interesting activity by women in terms of the family household and the whole links to the manufacturing sector, the clothing industry, in terms of the putting out system and those kinds of things. But the context that I'm looking at is really picking up sort of mid-70s onwards, where we've seen some very important changes. And I just want to try and outline those a little bit for you. So this is just a bit of a schematic way, one way of thinking about institutions and institutional change. And here I'm not trying to imply any sort of causation about what's caused what. I think it's a very fascinating question. But what I'm trying to do is just sort of map out some of the changes that we've seen, what's gone on in terms of spurring women's entrepreneurship. So the first place I would start is in terms of government policy and regulation. And I'm just highlighting a couple of things that I think are important. In terms of the Canadian context, one of the most important things I think is in really the early 70s. It comes out of even prior to that, sort of the late 60s, the whole rise of the Canadian women's movement, what we call the second wave of feminism. And in many ways that was almost a delayed response to part of what happened during the World War II period. We had a similar kind of phenomenon where the men went to war, women were needed in the labor force, we had a rewriting of tax laws, we had our first national child care program, so women could sort of move in and start to work. And it was not the case where every woman was working in the labor force, but there was a moment during the Second World War where things really shifted. And what happened post-World War II was that we saw legislation again rewritten, the tax code was rewritten, and women were expected to go back into the home. And there was sort of a period in the 50s and early 60s of sort of a heightened attempt to sort of draw women into the mothering role and those kinds of things. And so for whatever reasons, and this is a very big topic of debate in terms of what caused what, but by the late 60s we see a real push in terms of women's groups, a lot of it happening on campuses, but also in response to women's desire to get more education, access to jobs, and so on. And so in the early 70s in Canada, we have something called the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. It was a fascinating, if you go back and look at some of the historical documentation of this, they had hearings all across the country in most of the libraries, university libraries. You can go and see a stack of reports on different issues, education, training, with some of the first academic research really about women's place in the labor market. And so out of that came 167 recommendations addressing a whole range of things, discriminatory practices, the need to eliminate those, but also a real push on education and training. So we had, a rewriting of differential minimum wage laws that existed, the marriage bar, which basically existed either legislated or in policy terms where you were married and expected to give up your job. That all sort of went by the way. And we also had the development in '78 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, which really starts to entrench a lot of rights. So what we have through that period, through the 70s, to 2000, and it's not in any way that it was just sort of a steady uproad, that we've had a lot of incidents in the last decade where we see a bit of retrenchment around these issues. But I think most analysts would argue that we have a period where we see sort of the establishment or institutionalization of the notion of a right to work, that women have a right to work, they have legal recourse. And also they become extremely important to the economy, because during this time we have the rise of the service sector, we have very high levels of economic growth through the 70s and 80s, a lot of knowledge jobs that are appropriate for women. And so in a sense, the economy also needs women and brings them in. One other event here that I think is important was the 2003 Prime Minister's Task Force on Women Entrepreneurs. This was done under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. And it was also a very interesting exercise, again, hearings across the country trying to address various issues that women entrepreneurs faced. In some ways, it was very different than the Royal Commission because we don't see as much come out of it in terms of legislative change or policy change. But it was a very interesting exercise, I think, in the fact of really documenting the importance of that, of seeing the importance, for a Prime Minister to say women entrepreneurs play a key role and we need to understand more. And so I think where a lot of that knowledge has gone is in terms of helping to sort of bolster or change somewhat the kind of policies and programs that we see across the country that provide training or financing for women entrepreneurs. So that's, in a very brief nutshell, sort of the legislative context. And here I just want to talk a little bit then about what we see actually happening in the working economy during this same sort of period. So we can see, again, this is sort of drawing things out over a very long period of time. Labor force participation really dramatically jumping in Canada through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's kind of fallen down again a little bit in recent years, but it's extremely, very dramatic sort of jump when you look at it over the long duration. And so you can see how that the changes in the labor market then sort of freeing things up and allowing women to come into jobs, both married and then the total. And again, just to put us into context, Canada has one of the highest female labor force participation rates in the world. It has for, when you track it through for a number of years, it's always had a very high rate. And again, that becomes very important in terms of thinking then about why we see such a rise of women's entrepreneurship, because we have women in the labor market gaining experience, thinking about ideas, recognizing opportunities, and then parlaying that at a certain point into their own enterprises. The other thing I think that's been really critical, and I think this was, if you wanted to identify one thing out of the Royal Commission, it would be the emphasis on education. The Royal Commission is very much sort of a liberal feminist approach, let's get women human capital. It was a human capital approach to reducing gender inequities. And so what we see now as a result of that is that we have the majority of undergraduates are females across the country. We have, in areas like medicine, which was always very heavily dominated by men, we now have the majority of graduates who are women. And those are having interesting implications in terms of changing some of those professions. The medical profession is one now that's really having to deal more with work-family balance issues and those kinds of things. So it's an interesting phenomenon to think about how education sort of shapes the opportunities for women. It's allowed them to move more into the professions and other kinds of areas. Also the trades, although as well in Canada we have a similar phenomenon that you talk about, where women remain quite poorly represented in many of the science, engineering, and even IT types of areas. Now in terms of the household, this is the other aspect, and obviously we've got a lot of linkages going on here, but I just want to also sort of draw that out a little bit in terms of talking about what's happening then in this period of time and the kind of institutional changes that are going on. And if we look at the household, there's a couple of things happening which are really important. One is the whole delay in terms of family formation. So we see in Canada the notion that we sort of have a postmodern turn in the sense that we have this decoupling of marriage from childbearing and also from a particular sort of very institutionalized life course where we would expect that people would get married very early in their 20s and then they would have children and then, etc. They would sort of move along in this way. What we see is this delay in terms of first stage of marriage, and you can see it for women and for men. If we have the same graph for the age at which people begin to have their family, it also delays as well. And it's interesting if you look at the differences from the 60s to this only goes up to 2003, but there's, for women, we're looking at about a six-year difference there with sort of the time to do a degree maybe, or to do further education to get your foot into the labor market. So there's that delay going on in the household and in terms of how people sort of begin to form their families. The other thing that's interesting, and this again, it's linking back to the labor force participation issues, but if we look at who is in the labor market, we can see that working mothers are now the norm. Okay, so very much as in other industrialized countries, but it's very striking in terms of the shift that's happened from mid-70s this is early 2000, but in 2006 we have 70% of mothers who have children under 16 who are actually working. So we have this notion then that's very different than it was in the 60s or 70s, that once you have children, you leave. We have this notion of now of a continuous career, that people are engaged in working, or women are engaged in working sort of over the course of their lifetime. And it's motivated by a number of different reasons. I just thought this was interesting for us in terms of thinking about women's entrepreneurship, in terms of what people identify their reasons. Financial reasons are a huge part of why women return to work. But also there's a very clear career attachment as well, so it's not necessarily just that we need the income, but the career becomes important. Issues of isolation, and then also what I would sort of refer to as a forced employment, in a way people who need to go back because they're worried about taking an extended leave, they're worried about losing their job. But I think the thing here then is, as we move into talking about women's entrepreneurship, we begin to see how some of these play out for women in terms of their motivations to go into the entrepreneurial field. The other thing, just very quickly, is the rise of what we call, we have the rise of dual earner families because women continue working, but also what people call the female breadwinner. So this is a proportion of households where women actually out-earn their partner, and you can see that it's expanding. And I would expect if we had, 2010, it would be even more so because of the demise of the manufacturing sector. And this is really getting at, some interesting debates we've seen in Canada over the last over the last year really, around power differentials in the household, the fact that women sometimes now, because of education and because of the structure of the economy, actually have some better economic opportunities than do men, especially men who do not have a sort of high levels of education. So there's an interesting aspect going on there as well. And then one very last aspect which ties into this, I've put it separately, but it ties into all of these things, just attitudes, and you had mentioned attitudes towards working women. In Canada, there's different data that we could look at. This is just one, it's local data to my own province. But it's showing the shift just over a 10-year period, 1980, those who disapprove of the employment of married women who have young children, and then the way in which it shifts so that by 1991 you see a vast majority who do approve. It's just sort of this reverse shift in terms of what's going on. And Michael Adams has done a lot of more sort of public polling on this issue, but he finds very much the same just in terms of the shift of attitude. So the picture here we get then I think is a number of different things that are going on. A changing economy, changing policy and regulation around sort of a lessening of tolerance of discrimination against women, changing attitudes, and I think changes in the household as well that kind of all lead into a very different context that women are operating in. And so what I want to do from there then is to sort of just look a little bit more at the phenomenon of women's entrepreneurship more specifically, and again just sort of giving you a few details of the current situation and issues that I think are interesting. I should ask how much time I have.
You've got a good 15 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Good, thank you. So again, just back to this particular graph, looking at this particular trend. And one of the things I wanted to point out, and I had just noted very briefly, was the way in which we see the shift, the share of women in entrepreneurship really shifting. And that raises some interesting questions. We were talking earlier at coffee, Christiane and I, about how we define entrepreneurship and what it is, and how we as we start to see this expansion, we maybe see some different notions of what it means to be an entrepreneur, to be a business owner, and so on. Now what's interesting is even though we see this expansion, when we look at where women are as entrepreneurs, we see some very important distinctions, and this could be one way to maybe cut the data. And this is 2008, and it's from Labor Force Survey. We still see that despite this rapid growth, the vast majority of women remain in what are the blue, which is unincorporated, and solo self-employment. So they're working in the enterprise by themselves, maybe cutting hair, it may be doing accounting, it may be doing financial planning, it could be a range of things, but it's not incorporated. And they operate in a relatively different way. We have a growing group, the red there, the incorporated solo, which are really the professionals in many ways, and that is one area that has, I think, expanded very significantly if we were to map it out over time. And then in the top, the green and the yellow, we have the employer group, which has also expanded very significantly. But it's interesting again to see the differences, to see that yellow group where you have a fairly significant bunch that still remain unincorporated employers. So it's a different sort of business model and approach in terms of how people are moving into entrepreneurship. The other thing that's interesting, which I wanted to just highlight very briefly, as in Japan, in Canada, traditionally women have really concentrated into some key sectors. So if you look at the data, not over time, but if we look at it in 2008, we still see that about 3/4 of women are working in just 6 sectors. So there's this concentration, just the same way that we see in terms of employment patterns. But what is interesting is that when you look at the change over time, over a 20-year period, you can see that there's certain areas where we have much higher growth. So the bottom, the purple, is just showing the total growth that we've seen over that time to kind of benchmark who's ahead and who's behind at the average. And so the areas that we see when women moving into are the professional science and technology, finance, real estate, business services, construction, educational. And educational services is an interesting one because that's sort of an offshoot of this paring down, I think, of the public sector. Health services would be another area as well, although the growth has not been as high because there's also restrictions on that in terms of what the government would allow to happen. But the point here, I think, is that while we still have that concentration into key sectors, we are seeing a lot more disproportionate growth in areas that we could refer to as the creative economy, which should potentially be also more lucrative for women. And I'll talk about that in a minute a little bit more. The other thing I wanted to address, and again this links into what Philip was talking about the reasons why women become entrepreneurs. This is from a national representative survey that Statistics Canada did called the Survey of Self-Employment, and it forces people to choose one reason, and I've written about this, about the way in which it's very hard to disentangle. But if you ask people on a forced choice, you can see that for many women, independence is important, work-family balance, flexibility are important kinds of issues, so we're definitely getting into a certain kind or reason why women are moving into that. Challenge becomes important, family businesses, but what's interesting is more money is very, very low down in terms of the motivation, and that's not to say that all women are not interested, but what I find in my own research is we have a lot of different motivations and different approaches, and so there's a lot of diversity, I think, in terms of what we're seeing. And it stands out even more if you look at women compared to men. So this is the same data that I just showed, but we've inserted men in here. And what's interesting is that for men, key motivator is independence. However that's defined, and it would be an interesting conversation too to think about how people define these things. But again, you can see some key differences. Work, family, very, very minimal for men as the motivator, but important for women. And for men on the more money, a little bit more. But it's interesting because for men, really, it's this issue of independence. For women, I think we see much more motivation around work, family, flexibility, and also a challenge is something where we see women and men quite similar. And I want to just unpack this a little bit more, moving on to talk about key issues. And one of those then is looking at this issue of this diversity of why women move into entrepreneurship and what maybe the motivators are for them. I also want to talk very briefly, if I have time, about the performance gap, and then I'll just wrap up looking at job satisfaction. So just picking up on this thing about different motivations and why women move into entrepreneurship. In the research that I did for my book, which was based on qualitative interviews, and it's Alberta-based, an Alberta-based study, I came up with a typology that really seemed to emerge, which identified 4 different types of entrepreneurship. And I referred to them just as bosses, business moms, one-woman shows, and necessity entrepreneurs. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about this, because I think, again, what we see is we're seeing some significant diversity. And so while a lot of the public discourse around women's entrepreneurship is this notion that they need to be high growth and high performing, and there's sort of a certain model, and that is very important, and many women do aspire to that. Women are also using entrepreneurship for much different reasons that don't really fit within that particular discourse, and I think we need to have a better handle on that in order to understand what's going on. So bosses are really the classic group, and if you look at them using the Survey of Self-Employment, data, both the bosses and the one-woman shows, they would sort of account for about half of women entrepreneurs. Bosses, they have those classic motivations. They're seeking basically to have more challenge. Many of them have worked in organizations. They've sort of incubated ideas within organizations, and then they move out. So in the case of my group, all of those are heading much larger firms, and in my group, it was substantially larger firms. And they're very growth oriented. So when I spoke with them about their plans, it was always around, you know, what they were planning to do. And so just to give you a sense, this person is talking about the way in which I feel like if you're doing something for yourself, it's more of a challenge. You put more into it than when you're working for somebody else. You want to succeed. Whereas if you're working for somebody else, what do you care if you succeed or not? I just feel like it's a challenge to get in there and do it and see if you can really succeed or not. So these are very, you know, they'd be the classic type A women. They want something of their own, but it's not just of their own to kind of keep it here. It's to push out and to take it as far as they can. And so they really do fit with that, the high growth. And when you look at the kind of performance they have in my study, they were, you know, the high flyers. I mean, they skewed the distribution. And they're very happy, you know, when talking about she never realized how well off you could be if you run a business properly. So here you see women's entrepreneurship really fulfilling that idea that it can be something that is really emancipating for women financially, that they can get out and sort of surpass the gender wage gap that exists in the labor force and really become more economically independent. Now, contrasted to that, we have a group called the Business Mums, and again, if you look at the survey of self-employment and take a cut of that, it's about 23% on a national basis. And what you see here is women who are really motivated by, the name implies, that by work-family issues. And so a lot of them, they're far more likely to work part-time, and they're also very interested in constraining the business. And so basically what I see is this is in many ways sort of a remnant of the Royal Commission, to the extent that it emphasized human capital, it emphasized getting women into the labor market, but we don't, in terms of childcare, it never really took care of that component of the economic puzzle. So for women who've worked where a household needs the income, this is a strategy for them to have their children and to be able to continue to contribute to the household and to keep a hand in whatever profession they may have. So they have a very different orientation. And so they use home-based businesses. You know, the vast majority of the women in my group, would probably like 3/4 of them, would be in a home-based business. And they try and sort of get those efficiencies by blurring the boundaries between what they're doing. So they just talk about the way they can work through supper or whatever, and just sort of basically organize the business around their children's schedules. So it's a very child-centric, in a way, approach. And in some cases, it's very deliberate. Some people they've decided they're going to step out of the labor, sort of traditional employment, and set up a business this way. In other cases, it was reactive, where women realized once they had children, there was no way they could go back to being a lawyer and working, you know, 80 hours a week. And so they set up a home-based business and do it that way. And it works well for many of them, but as I've noted here, growth presents challenges for them. So if they're successful on an economic standpoint, in the sense of attracting clients, things begin to spin out of control for them. So she says, everybody says, well, if you go into your own business, you'll be able to work part-time, have the kids at home and all that, and you honestly believe it. But if you're in demand, you know, then you begin to have problems, you know, because people get to know you as a provider, and that makes it difficult because you don't want to put restrictions on your time. And what's interesting here as well is for women who do this as a strategy, sort of midstream in terms of having a family, they find as well they have far more difficulty even having maternity leaves because they can't stop the business. So it's an interesting strategy. It works well for many, but it's a very different approach, and it's not without its own, you know, problems as well. One women shows are a different group. They're typically motivated by independence, the quest for meaningful work, or for in some cases it's a positive work environment. And many also have what I would call post-corporate values. They're organizational refugees in the sense. And it's interesting is that the research I did here was in the late 1990s, where we'd gone through a very sort of messy period in terms of the economy, where there were you know, a lot of sort of cutbacks and layoffs. And so people moved out of organizations because they'd had a bad experience as well. That was a lot of what I heard. So this person talks about going into business for yourself. You can make the environment whatever you want to be. There's no one else dictating that to you. And what's interesting for many of the women that I spoke with, the notion of doing something that had meaning for them. So not something that they, were being given by an employer, but something that they could sort of take on as their own. So it has to have meaning for me personally, but it also has to have meaning for the people I'm doing the work with. Like the project I mentioned, that was life-changing for them, and it was fulfilling for me to know that it made a difference for somebody else. And so that became out very strongly for a number of them in terms of what one of the motivators was. Positive work environment, which I've mentioned. And again, here it's interesting. The issue of growth for them, again, they can have a lot of success, but they're not actually interested. And this woman was hilarious. She was a nurse who had moved into doing consulting for healthcare developers who were developing residences. And she just, she really developed a reputation and had the potential that, she could have taken the business into, I think, to be very, very lucrative. And she just says, why do I want to grow? I'm just happy doing what I'm doing. So again, it really runs against that notion of that, the high growth and sort of increasingly improving performance. And then the last group, the necessity entrepreneurs, which were very important in Canada at the time when I was doing this. We had a lot of layoffs in the public sector. And so these are people that are motivated because they've lost a job or because they've got a lack of opportunities in their particular profession or job area. And so again, job loss, that was the reason why I opened my business. I thought about having a business earlier. I just knew it was very hard, particularly in my profession. And so I didn't do it until the last moment, until I was really forced. And what's interesting here, of course, is that when you look at them in terms of a performance analysis, they're the ones who really are struggling, not surprisingly. They're also less satisfied in terms of job satisfaction, but they are the ones very much at the lower end of the income levels. Some do become, people have written about this, about the notion of becoming a convert. They go through Gaines and Wheelock in England have talked about that notion of being forced into it, but then becoming a convert. And some of them in my study did, but a number of them, I would say the majority, really were hoping and praying that they would eventually be able to no longer be self-employed or in their own business. Just very briefly then, I want to move from the issue of diversity, which I sort of see as a core issue, to just talk about performance gap and job satisfaction. And I have a couple minutes, so I'll be very quick. The puzzle of the performance gap, I don't think I need to talk about this in detail. It's something that would be familiar to many of you. When we look at performance of women's businesses, whether we measure them by revenues or employees, what have you, we can see that there's a very significant gap, and it's a consistent finding when you look across countries. And so there's a question there of what it is. Is it in the industrial sector? Is it sort of the strategy? There's a variety of different things that we could look at. In Canada, what we see is a very significant performance gap. This is from Industry Canada data. If we look at revenue, for majority female and majority male owned, we see a gender gap of under 50% in terms of revenue and just over 50% in terms of net profit. So basically it's an interesting insight because in fact we have this notion of entrepreneurship as being highly lucrative for women, or that's the aim. And yet if you look at it in terms of a gendered gap, economic gap, women actually do much worse on average than they would if they remained in traditional employment. And I think here related to this, there's been far less attention to this, but again it links into this question of diversity. What we see really in entrepreneurship is a polarization between women. So we have, if we look at the Profit 100, it's sort of the top 100 list of women entrepreneurs in Canada, you see incredibly high levels of economic performance in terms of annual revenue, sort of median annual revenue and so on, and also in terms of employee size. But if you go back to look at some of the people that I'm looking at in terms of my study who have these small businesses, the vast majority of them would be making, in terms of the kind of profit they might make for income, the income they might report would be under $40,000 a year. And there's about a quarter who would report in terms of income of under $20,000 a year. So we've got some very significant economic polarization, which I think is an important issue. And the very last issue, though, which I'll end on a positive note, is that, and this is one of my main areas of interest, is that if you look at job satisfaction and work quality for women who are in their own jobs, and this is drawing on a nationally representative survey by Canadian Policy Research Networks, you can see that entrepreneurs have much higher levels of satisfaction across the whole range. So the general question, are you satisfied or very satisfied? 86% of them saying yes, compared to about 68% of employees. And you can go down the list in terms of work schedule, the freedom to decide what you're doing, the kind of work environment you're in, the feelings of accomplishment and interesting work, so getting into that notion of meaningful work. And they're high also for employees, which is interesting for us to know here, which leads credence to the idea that job satisfaction measures aren't always tapping into sort of the difficulties people have at work. But again, we do see that very sort of a fairly steady discrepancy there that suggests that it provides a lot in terms of the softer, the more intrinsic kinds of aspects of work. And then this very last slide, which is the notion, just a different way of thinking about it, about job quality deficit. So if we ask people what they have in a job and what they want in a job, we can measure a job quality debt. And basically, so what you want is you want to have less of this one. And so when we look at things like communication, we can see that entrepreneurs have a very tiny deficit. I mean, they basically almost got what they want, okay? For employees, people who are working for other people, it's a different scenario. And so what's interesting is that on all of these, entrepreneurs have lower levels of deficits, which again just gives credence to this notion that it's a very attractive kind of work for people. But again, where we see the difference emerging is on extrinsic rewards. So income, security, I haven't talked about this ability to plan for retirement. All of these issues are huge, I think, in terms of women's entrepreneurship. So just to, I thought those were hidden, but they're not. To wrap up, my own view is that we'll continue to see this expansion, I think, in terms of levels, and I think we'll also see growing diversity in terms of the group. And so I think one of the challenges is sort of mapping that, trying to understand what's going on, trying to understand different populations and different business approaches. The issue of the performance gap will persist in terms of trying to understand what's going on there. And for people like me, there'll be an interest in trying to understand as well more about job satisfaction and job quality. I think in some cases people are making very deliberate trade-offs between job quality and economic returns. So thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize if I went over.
We have a couple minutes for questions before coffee break.
It's not a question, just one comment. Few people laugh about the one part. My name is Miho, and I immigrated in Canada in 1993, and I'm in the food industry for over 20 years. I was a server. I became a single mom about 5 years ago, and I had to create more income. So I searched about the entrepreneurship, and then I still work for the restaurant, but really limited. Like I work only 1 or 2 days a week now, and then basically my business, I work on my business only 2 hours a day, and then I create enough income to live. And I think that the comment that you showed, maybe that the person didn't choose the right business. There's a business allow us to do that, create enough income, just working a minimum amount of the hours.
So you're saying that you think that the kind of income that we see is related to the hours? Is that?
No. If you are working as for someone, like a job,
yes,
only create just exchange of the time for that money. But if you become an entrepreneur, you can become you can create more income.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think you can in some cases, and I do think it depends on the kind of hours that you're committing to. I mean, and what I'm talking about is what I see in terms of national data and what's going on. So for many people who put in significant hours and are in industries which are what I would call high return industries, I think the women there can do much better than they can working for an employer. But I think there are some industries where, where there's very low barriers to entry, they're overcrowded, and the sort of the profit margins are extremely small. I think there, sometimes women, they do not do as well as they could working for an employer. So I do think industry makes a big difference in terms of the kind of performance that we see.
Yeah, I think it depends what kind of a business they choose.
I'm curious, in your own business, is it closely related to the work you did for your employer? Did you get your ideas
Nothing
from?
to do.
No,
Totally different.
Very different. Okay, that's interesting. And which do you enjoy more?
Oh, actually, working as a waitress is fun. Like I like it. But lots of limitation. I'm 40 years old now, and then I see some 3 ladies older than me. They have no future. They have no hope. And then employers can cut that hour, just lay off. I'm actually on lay off now. I'm not gonna have any shift for 3-4 months.
Okay.
So really, I have I'm living on my business income, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So
that's a very important, interesting issue, and I didn't highlight that here, but one of the questions I'd asked the women about was job security, which I would include as a facet of extrinsic work situation, so income and how secure your job is. And I expected them to feel a bit insecure, especially if it was a startup business or it wasn't that financially lucrative. But actually they had very high levels of satisfaction with their job security. They felt sort of what you're saying in a sense. I remember this quote, one woman said, I had one boss, but I have 10 clients. And so I have way more security than I ever did. So there was sort of this sense of being, and also more control than this feeling of control a little bit, that an employer can lay you off or limit your hours or what have you. But if it's your own business, at least it might be tough, but you can try and do something to find some other opportunities.
Ken, do you think though that also reflects where Canada is with respect to the kind of job, the attitude towards employee and employee relations, and that how there used to be more security in the workplace, and that now nobody knows whose job is safe.
I think that's
and so you might as
well
well work for yourself, because at least it's up to you to build it up, as opposed to relying on the institutional framework that we used to rely on.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and that certainly came out in some of my conversations. When I did my interviews, the Alberta government had just gone through a gutting of the public sector, and they actually had in healthcare an incentive program. So if you would give up your job, we'll fund you. It was like $20,000 to do small business training as a way to kind of pull people in. And so the people in that sector felt exactly what you were saying, that they just felt there'd been such a break in trust that even if they had been a long-term employee within healthcare, so the nurse that I was speaking about who developed this other business, they just felt that they were actually more secure, your point, because of the kind of shifts and the insecurity that exists. The other thing is that with the layoffs as well, you have the notion of corporate survivors, or this, downsizing being a survivor of that. So people who get left in the companies, it's a very difficult work environment for them. They're doing, 150% or what have you. And so I had, again, this was linked more to positive work environment, where a couple of women who had they had survived layoffs and been in a terrible, sort of work situation in terms of the kind of demands on them. And so that was sort of what pushed them, not pushed them out, but led them eventually to a quality of working life. Yeah, absolutely.
On that note, we will have coffee and continue the conversation. Thank you.